Here's the simple truth. Most M365 front ends end up looking half-baked or dangerously off-brand. That messy authentication flow isn't just annoying, it's a risk. Today, I'll walk you through how the Graph Toolkit gives you durable, secure M365 integration blocks, pre-built React components that drag and drop directly into your app. What really changes when you use these? Let's break down how each component can standardize your UX and finally keep your boss, your users, and your compliance officer happy. Why custom M365 integrations break down. If you've ever stared at an M365 connected app and wondered why it feels patched together, yes, even the ones from vendors who should know better, you're not imagining it. There's a reason half these interfaces feel like different teams built them on different planets. The typical developer story goes a little something like this. You're asked to add Microsoft 365 features to your app. First, you Google how to do Microsoft login in React. You hunt down a stack of tutorials, stitch together authentication with MSAL or ADAL, manage redirects, and suddenly you're knee-deep in OAuth flows. You get the login working, sort of. Then your manager says, hey, can we let users pick colleagues from our directory? Maybe you need to show calendars or meetings next. Now you're dealing with several APIs, scattered documentation, and you're probably scraping together UI bits from open source, outdated GitHub gists, or whatever half-finished sample you can find. That's just the technical pain. The bigger mess creeps in slowly. Each part feels slightly off. The login uses one font, but the main app uses another. The color palette drifts. Loading spinners look homemade. Even icons don't quite match. Left unchecked, your app starts to resemble a Craigslist couch sitting next to a West Elm dining set. Functional, but who really wants to live with that? And then it gets real. Imagine this. You finally launch and users click sign in, only to end up on a login page that looks nothing like Microsoft. Instead of the familiar M365 blue, they see an empty form with your company logo and an enter password prompt that raises eyebrows. People start asking, is this legit? A few users refuse to sign in. IT gets nervous and starts poking around for phishing attempts. You're stuck explaining that yes, it's safe, but even you look twice. By lunchtime, the complaints have hit your inbox and your project lead is asking why this wasn't flagged in testing. Let's put a number on this pain. A recent Forrester study commissioned by Microsoft found that teams spend up to 40% of their project time building and fixing user authentication and directory connections, work that more often than not quietly fails audits. That's not just dev hours wasted. It's every late night patch, every quick fix, every time someone says, well, it kind of works now. Let's ship it. One misstep, maybe an unpatched custom OAuth flow or overlooked consent screen, and you end up at the top of someone's security playbook for all the wrong reasons. Trying to solve this with custom code isn't just inefficient, it becomes a branding and compliance minefield. Matching Microsoft style with your own components is like trying to assemble IKEA shelves and then sneak in a custom-made mahogany leg. Something always wobbles, even if you sand it down and throw a tablecloth on top. The deeper you go, the more the seams show. Tiny things matter. Microsoft's own design language cues trust, especially for M365 users who've been trained to look for certain buttons or flows. Break that consistency and you break user confidence. And when branding slips, it's not just about pretty UI. A mismatched experience can undermine the whole promise of enterprise security. Here's the compliance catch. In regulated industries, UX isn't just window dressing, it's part of the audit trail. A login page that looks official matters because phishing protections and user trust depend on visual consistency. When you cobble together custom sign-ins and homemade people search, you're practically begging for a security desk to flag your app. Even a well-meaning fix can create gaps. Maybe you store tokens wrong, forget to handle consent pop-ups, or display user names in a way that leaks information. Legal and IT will call this a risk long before the users do. But the real kicker, most teams fall into this pit, not because they want to, but because they aren't sure what else to do. They spend days or weeks writing and debugging functions for problems that Microsoft already solved. By the time you try to add a dashboard, you're still working out why calendar events aren't syncing or why the people picker sometimes just refuses to load. The wheel gets reinvented one more time in another SaaS app that nobody quite trusts. So is there a way to avoid this patchwork and get something consistent, branded, and secure from day one? What if, instead of gluing together bits and hoping nobody notices, you could just drop in actual Microsoft branded building blocks? No mismatched joints, no weird colors, no duct tape. Most of the time, dev teams keep putting in work to patch cracks that shouldn't even exist, and they end up supporting that code long after the feature shipped. Imagine, instead, if you could reach for perfectly matched Lego bricks made for M365 apps. No more hoping your login looks right or stressing that your agenda widget behaves the way users expect. The question isn't whether it's possible. The reality is these building blocks are already here, if you know where to look. The Graph Toolkit, plug and play for real M365 functionality. Imagine handing off every headache around authentication, calendar pulls, and people lookup to a single set of building blocks. Blocks that just line up and work as if they were snapped together straight from Microsoft's own workshop. That isn't a pipe dream. That's the reality of the Microsoft Graph Toolkit if you're building with React. Most devs spend untold hours wrangling permissions, fighting React state, and running into mismatches whenever they try to layer on M365 features. The toolkit asks a different question. What if, instead of reinventing everything, you could just import trusted React components already recognized and maintained by Microsoft that fill these gaps? No surprises, no guesswork, no UX drift. So what is this toolkit really? For those still unfamiliar, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit is a library made up of React components built to do one thing well: snap real Microsoft 365 functionality directly into your front end. This isn't some hopeful open source project with unknown maintainers. It's developed, shipped, and updated by Microsoft. The moment you import one of its components, you get built-in connectivity to Microsoft Graph, which means hooks into Azure Active Directory, Outlook, Teams, OneDrive, the works. You're not bridging APIs by hand or scrolling through endless patch requests. These components already know what an M365 user expects, both visually and functionally. Now, there's the natural skepticism. Pre-built usually means you get what you get. Static, inflexible, and likely a mismatch for anything halfway custom. The Graph Toolkit throws that assumption out. Each component, whether it's for login, finding colleagues, or showing today's meetings, is both opinionated and customizable. Microsoft's own brand standards are baked into every pixel, but you still control the overall fit with your app's unique style. And because Microsoft expects teams to mix and match these into far more complex dashboards, every component slots in with the bigger M365 story without blowing up your app's architecture. Let's see how that hits the ground. Take authentication. Usually plugging M365 sign-in into your React app isn't just a one-liner. It's provider setup, token footsing, handling consent pop-ups, storing state, catching expired logins, and hoping your UI doesn't look like a phishing attempt. With the Graph Toolkit, you literally pull in a login component, drop it into your page with a single tag or component reference, and get a branded Microsoft sign-in experience, complete with compliance, accessibility, and all the familiar cues users rely on. It isn't just surface-level polish. The toolkit component directs users through Microsoft's established OAuth logic, pulling tokens and handling scopes the same way Microsoft apps do it themselves. This isn't theoretical, it's what you see in practice. Imagine spinning up a new dashboard and needing to let users check their schedules. The typical journey: find the Graph API endpoints, get an authentication token, write your call to me events, and translate JSON to a readable calendar view. With the Graph Toolkit's agenda component, you import, render, and those events just appear, styled, synchronized, and using the familiar language of Outlook. If you were watching a demo, you'd see a dev drag the login component into a new React app, run it, and instantly get Microsoft-branded sign-in, with the user routed straight through the M365 permission process. 5 minutes and you're where it would take half a sprint to get with hand-rolled code. You don't have to take my word for it. Developers who have crossed over from custom integrated M365 setups to the Graph Toolkit usually say the same thing. It's not just less work, it feels like cheating. Time that would have gone to writing boilerplate flows or patching user directories now goes to features that make their app unique. One developer put it simply, we rebuilt our user dashboard with toolkit components and finished 3 weeks faster. The only thing we did differently was stop writing authentication and people search from scratch. The core of this payoff isn't just speed. It's about writing dramatically less code, closing off entire categories of bugs, and inheriting Microsoft's own compliance logic. No need to chase updates when the identity flow changes upstream. When you adopt the toolkit, You're bridging your app directly to the M365 world, rather than living in a shadow version that's always out of date or 2 steps behind on branding. This isn't a stopgap, and it isn't some half-hearted wrapper. Microsoft actively maintains this bridge, so your users always see the real, trusted Microsoft experience start to finish. So we've talked about what you get at a high level: reliable, branded, secure plug-and-play components that slice days, even weeks, of typical integration efforts. Less fragile code, fewer late fixes, instant trust from M365 users who spot the familiar UI. Whether you're rolling out new dashboards or rebuilding legacy front ends, using the Graph Toolkit means you're shipping with Microsoft's own UX guardrails in place. And because these aren't all or nothing, you can import exactly what you need. The overhead is minimal. We've seen how the toolkit changes the ground rules. But which pieces do teams actually use the most? And how do they play out in real apps? It helps to get specific, so let's zero in on the key components at the heart of most projects: login, people picker, and agenda, and see how they stack up the moment you add them to your app. Component breakdown: login, people picker, and agenda in action. Let's get clear on what actually comes in this so-called box of Lego for Microsoft 365 apps. There are plenty of components in the Graph Toolkit, but 3 show up almost everywhere: login, people picker, and agenda. If you've ever tried to wire up any of these by hand, you know the pain points. Authentication keeps breaking between dev and production. Searching users in Azure AD means fighting paged API calls. And calendar widgets always seem to miss that one feature Outlook users expect. Most front-end devs have gone down the rabbit hole of trying to build just one of these, usually because some project manager insists the off-the-shelf version won't feel custom enough. The reality: the deeper you get, the harder it is to maintain your own version, and the more you realize just how quickly DIY breaks down. Start with login. It seems so simple: connect users, show a username, handle logout. But the minute you want to hook into Microsoft's OAuth, manage refresh tokens, and keep session state predictable across browser tabs, the homegrown approach unravels. The login component from Graph Toolkit is exactly what it sounds like. Drag it into your React codebase, set a couple of config props, and it handles everything from the redirect flow to silent token refresh. There's no need to touch OAuth libraries directly, and you don't need to worry about keeping up with Microsoft's latest identity quirks. Even better, every bit of the UI feels authentic to users who see the M365 login every day, down to the branding, error messaging, and consent prompts. Mistakes around authentication aren't just frustrating, they're a compliance risk. With this component, you skip most of the user-reported bugs around login issues, and IT security is less likely to flag your build as suspicious. The second cornerstone is People Picker. If you haven't tried to tie into Azure AD's People Search yourself, count yourself lucky. Building a reliable directory search isn't just about hitting an API. You need to debounce user input, handle partial matches, and keep the UI responsive under heavy loads. The Graph Toolkit's People Picker solves all of this right out of the box. It acts as a fully managed bridge to your Azure AD directory, so users can easily search for and select colleagues, whether it's autocomplete for names, syncing with the right visuals, or dealing with hundreds of users. The underlying code takes care of rate limiting, permissions, and error handling that most homegrown solutions miss. And it gives you a UI that matches what people already trust in Microsoft apps. Nobody wonders if they're about to send calendar invites to the wrong John S. This isn't just a nice to have. It saves hours fiddling with subtle bugs like dropped searches, double results, or stale user lists that can haunt you months after launch. Then there's Agenda. If you've ever written custom code to pull a user's events via the Graph API, it's never as quick as the docs make it sound. You have to authenticate, scope the right permissions, fetch and parse events, sort out recurring meetings, and make sure the calendar view updates in real time. Even after you pull it off, the calendar probably looks different from what anyone would call M365 style. The agenda component lets you surface a user's real Outlook calendar in moments. Events appear with the layout, fonts, and color cues people expect from Microsoft's ecosystem. Updates sync instantly, so if someone gets a meeting invite, it shows up immediately in the UI. That's the sort of little detail people actually notice. You avoid duplicate support tickets about missed meetings or unsynced invites. One of the less talked about benefits is that each of these components comes with Microsoft's branding, design language, and UX cues built in as defaults. That means you don't have to keep referencing Fluent UI docs or try to reverse engineer little pieces of Microsoft's design system. It's all pre-styled and accessible. which matters not just for polish, but for trust. There's no confusing moment for users because every button, error message, and dropdown already matches what they see across M365. For regulated industries, or anywhere compliance is on the table, that's non-negotiable. You avoid the hassle of custom approvals or awkward explanations to legal about where your login screen came from. Now, you might worry that pre-built means cookie cutter, but each toolkit component exposes props and styling hooks, so you can tweak layouts, add class names, and adapt the pieces to your own app shell. You can change colors, adjust borders, and even wire up additional logic on events without breaking Microsoft's design standards. With built-in extensibility, you get just enough room to give your app a signature feel, but not so much room you accidentally ruin the user experience or trigger a flag in a branding audit. It's a safe, controlled way to look professional while still matching your product. The payoff shows up where it counts. Every time you skip custom logic, you cut project hours and future bug tickets. These three components alone can shrink the average front-end project timeline by days or even weeks, freeing you up to build features people actually care about. Plus, your support team stops fielding the same ugly edge cases about login, directory lookup, and calendar glitches. But that leaves a big question for the skeptics out there. If it's this easy, is there a catch? You might wonder about the hit to performance, whether these components scale, or if you're boxing yourself in for the future. That's where things get interesting, especially when you start thinking about architecture across larger enterprise projects. Scaling up, performance, productivity, and the M365 app blueprint. If you've ever been responsible for deploying a Microsoft 365 connected app, someone has probably asked the same question that comes up every time a team considers plug-and-play components. Aren't we going to lose control? The worry is honest. The moment you pull in packaged functionality, people get nervous about performance dips, trouble scaling, or that awful sense of being boxed in by someone else's decisions. Developers who live in the React world want snappy apps and clean code, not a bloated black box that slows down users or refuses to play nicely with the rest of the ecosystem. Let's set the record straight on this. The reality is most plug-and-play libraries in the broader JavaScript landscape do feel heavy or generic because they try to cover too many scenarios at once or assume lowest common denominator design. The Microsoft Graph Toolkit is different because it's streamlined for the exact work it needs to do, talking smoothly to Microsoft Graph, managing authentication, and surfacing M365 data in real time. That focus means the components are surprisingly lightweight. Each one calls the Graph API in the background, but only brings in what's needed for your app. No sprawling dependencies, no extra runtime weight from features you never use. It all comes down to smart, modern React code designed with M365 as the center, not an afterthought. Performance is a legitimate concern, especially if you're building apps that could end up with hundreds or thousands of users hitting critical parts of Microsoft 365 at the same time. The toolkit is tuned for these exact scenarios. Take login, people search, or agenda features. These components use lazy loading and data caching out of the box. So the first time a user loads a calendar, only the minimum set of data is fetched. If the same user jumps back in an hour later, the toolkit checks what's already cached and either updates quietly in the background or serves up the cached profile or event data immediately. This often leads to faster loads than what most hand-rolled integrations deliver, since the toolkit's maintainers track Microsoft Graph API changes and keep optimizations up to date behind the scenes. Where the toolkit really pulls ahead is in error handling and resilience. The edge cases that usually haunt custom dev, expired tokens, network dropouts, weird API throttling, are handled inside each component. If a token fails, the login picks it up and refreshes. If a network hiccup drops an agenda load, the user sees a clean, native-looking error message, not a raw JSON dump or a broken calendar widget. Responsive design is included, so your components look and feel right on desktops, tablets, or phones without any extra media query wrangling. These details save time in testing and debugging when deadlines are looming. Let's talk about the side-by-side, building a user dashboard with and without the toolkit. Start from scratch and you'll juggle Azure AD, graph scopes, UI state, token storage, and half a week of research into what endpoint changed in the last API release. Then you're fiddling with CSS to get the login button positioned, working out accessibility on directory search, and hopping between 3 docs tabs. In a real-world project, that's several sprints before the first usable demo. Swap in Graph Toolkit components, and you drop in login, a people picker, and agenda view within an afternoon. You'll have time left to actually build something unique since those plumbing problems are gone. In practice, teams report cutting total delivery time by weeks, not because corners were cut, but because they finally stopped sweating the basics that Microsoft has already polished. This is where productivity jumps out as the main theme. Instead of trying to keep up with platform changes from Microsoft or fielding constant bug reports on homegrown authentication flows, you put your team on the business logic that actually matters to users. The grunt work of make it look and work like Microsoft stops being your job altogether. Bugs and support tickets tied to expired tokens, botched consent flows, or broken directory search just don't show up in the same numbers once you're running on the toolkit. On the architecture front, the modularity matters more than most first realize. You aren't expected to swallow the whole toolkit all at once. Each component functions as a standalone piece, so you can add login, but skip agenda or people search if your project doesn't need them. This fits neatly into any modern React architecture, making it simple to write custom wrappers or compose new dashboard layouts as your app grows. If you need to scale up, all the optimizations, caching, batching, error handling, scale with you automatically, rather than expecting you to rewrite code once your app goes from pilot to production. What stands out is how the toolkit flips the usual trade-offs. Speed, reliability, and compliance aren't art projects, they're the default. Your developers focus on the logic that sets your app apart, while Microsoft's team keeps the integration up to date and secure. The less time you spend patching plumbing, the more time you have to build actual experiences for users without losing any of the trust or performance they expect from M365. So you see, using the Graph Toolkit isn't just a way to ship code faster. It gives your app a foundation that matches enterprise demand for scale, reliability, and security right out of the box. So you can skip dozens of headaches and know you're landing squarely in Microsoft's best practices, compliance, speed, and the design language everyone instantly recognizes. The next step is knowing how to actually start. And with a toolkit this modular, the only real limit is which M365 features you want to offer first. If you're already picturing a component that could replace a week's worth of work on your roadmap, you wouldn't be the first. If you've ever wondered whether you're spending too much time wrestling with authentication and branding, the answer is probably yes. The Graph Toolkit strips out all that duct tape and guesswork. Its React components don't just help you work faster, they ensure your app lands squarely in line with Microsoft's brand, compliance, and user experience expectations. This isn't about chasing the new shiny thing, it's about building apps people actually trust. Try swapping in a toolkit component and watch how much smoother onboarding, calendar, or people search becomes. Let me know in the comments which piece could save your team the most headaches.